So my name is Hunada, and I'm happy to be moderating this session today. First of all, thank you so much, Professor Ilan, for being with us today. We're honored to host you. We would also like to thank all the audience for joining us online. A special thank you to Mosaic Center or Al-Quds Library in Berlin for hosting a live screening of this session. Mosaic or Al-Quds Library is a Palestinian-owned and run library and community center. We'll probably receive questions from them, as I mentioned. We're also aware that actually there is another screening in a Rote Cafe in Berlin, and we thank them for organizing it. We send the audience everywhere our greetings. In today's session, we will start with a quick introduction about our group, who are the organizers, and then an introduction about Professor Ilan. After that, we will have a dialogue with the professor, followed by a Q&A, receiving questions from you guys. So this is our agenda for today. Let's get started. This lecture is co-organized by a decolonial research group at Humboldt University of Berlin and Student Coalition Berlin. We are a group of students from all different disciplines at HU and Freie Universität Berlin, who are both deeply concerned about the unfolding events in Palestine, Israel, and the ongoing discourse and knowledge production about this topic in Germany, or the lack of it for that matter. You can check our social media pages for more information about our other activities, please. Now moving to a quick introduction about Professor Ilan for those who do not know him. Ilan Pappé is a professor of history and a director of the European Center of Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. Professor Pappé is also a historian and a social and political activist. He was formerly a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Haifa. He is the author of The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, The Modern Middle East, A History of Modern Palestine, One Land, Two People, and 10 Myths About Israel. Pappé is described as one of Israel's new historians who, since the release of the pertinent British and Israeli government document in the early 1980s, have been rewriting the history of Israel's creation in 1948. Now, finally, Professor, we come to you. So we can start with our questions. I cannot start without commenting on what is happening today. When we first actually planned it, we didn't know that it will coincide with the first day of the hearing for the South Africa's genocide case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. And I think or hope that we will get to hear your opinion on it later after we kick off our questions. But I really want to start with a question that mixes you and the Nakba in a way. I mean, not metaphorically. So, because I think there's a kind of relation about your history, where you started and how you started defining the term Nakba. Could you tell us a little bit about your personal story of how you became related to the question of al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, starting with you growing up as a typical Israeli citizen, if I may say?
Yeah.
And then looking at that journey, how do you define and describe the term Nakba, Nakba al-Mustamirra? And so when did it start and is it over?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, Hunaida, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to talk to you all wherever. I understand you are in different places. So wherever you are, it would be a great pleasure and a good opportunity to talk to people, especially in Germany. Where did it start? Well, as you mentioned, rightly so, I was born in Haifa, in Israel, and had a very, I would say, very typical Israeli Jewish Zionist upbringing in life. in a sense, which meant that there was this typical Israeli trajectory where you finish school, and after you finish school, you go to the army because you are obliged to go to the army. Of course, if you have different ideologies, as many, not many, but many more young people today do, you may even refuse to go to the army, but in those days it was unthinkable. And I unfortunately, I even had to participate in a war, the 1973 war, as a soldier on the Golan Heights. And up to, I would say, up to ending the military service and beginning my academic life, first of all, for the first degree, and then more importantly, for the doctorate, I also subscribed to the Zionist ideology and point of view. The meeting point, so to speak, with the Nakba, first of all, that of 1948, and then redefining what it means, and then connecting even more easily to the term that you use, the Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba, all that happened within a journey. So it didn't happen in one day. You know, you don't have an epiphany and suddenly you desert your ideological or moral point of view and you adopt another one, especially in a situation of a conflict where when you begin to believe in the claims of the other side, so to speak, you are likely to be treated as a traitor. So there's no, the incentive is not very high there to to criticize fundamentally what your own tribe, so to speak, believes in. So it was a journey, and the journey began, I think, for various reasons. One is that from very early on, I was interested in history. I was quite clear to me that I would like to become, if one can call it that way, a professional historian, which meant that I did the necessary recruitment to the academic trajectory that takes you to university, and then hopefully you become a professional historian. Secondly, and that's nothing unique in this, as an historian, I thought the most interesting history I want to discover is my own history, the place I was born in, and so on. So that was another factor. And then comes the plot becomes a bit more complicated. In order to become a proper historian, you have, of course, to do as some of our audience would know, you have to go to the postgraduate phase. It's not enough to finish an undergraduate degree in history. You need to go to do your own research. And by coincidence, without even knowing exactly why, I decided that I wanted to do my research outside of Israel. And I chose the University of Oxford, and I chose an Arab supervisor, the late Albert Horani. And through him, I became acquainted with the Palestinian and Arab point of view, which I would not have been able to receive if I did my PhD in Israel. Secondly, and that was my decision, I thought the most interesting year to research as a student would be the most controversial one, namely 1948. I mean, I was aware that in the Zionist narrative on which I grew, 1948 was a year of miracle, the end of 2,000 years of Jewish exile and the creation of a Jewish state against all odds. But I was already aware that there was a Palestinian narrative, which was exactly a mirror image, that 1948 was the worst year in the history of Palestine and it ended in catastrophe. So I decided to look more specifically on 1948. I was lucky that the time that I started my PhD in Oxford was exactly the time that, according to declassification rules in different places, such as the United Nations, Britain, and Israel too, at that time, documents relating to 1948 were opened for the first time for historians. Or as we call it in professional language, they were declassified. And I was probably one of the first professional historians to see these documents. And looking at that documents from the outside in Oxford, under the supervision of an Arab professor, enabled me to understand that actually what I was looking at contradicted fundamentally everything I knew about 1948, everything I was taught about 1948. And this was reflected in my PhD that became my first book later, and included me in what was called later the group of new Israeli historians, namely Israeli historians who used archival material to challenge the Zionist narrative. And if you challenge the Zionist narrative about 1948, it means that you accept many important chapters in the Palestinian narrative. It's kind of a zero-sum game in many ways. And the most important thing that you learn is that the Palestinians, contrary to what you were taught in the Zionist narrative, did not leave voluntarily Palestine, but they became refugees because they were the victims of a massive expulsion by the Israeli forces. But it takes time, as you would know. I finished my PhD in 1984. I wrote my first book in 1988, but I needed all kinds of developments on the ground, like the first Intifada, the second Intifada, and everything that went between the two Intifadas on the ground to be able to see even in a better and clearer way what happened in 1948. And that's when I decided to use a different perspective on 1948, not just to use the Israeli archives and say, okay, they were expelled because there was a war, but rather to look at through the paradigm of ethnic cleansing. But only in 2006, I was able to publish my book because quite a lot of publishers were reluctant to use the term ethnic cleansing in conjunction with Israel. And this was also assisted by the fact that the Israelis have now most of the archives are closed, but in those days they were still open. So there was one wave of opening documents of 48 after 30 years, and then there was another wave of opening other documents after 50 years after 48. So I even had more material that substantiated for me the idea that actually what I was looking at in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. And just to remind our viewers and listeners, ethnic cleansing is an intentional mass expulsion of people because of who they are, not because of what they have done. And it's motivated by an ideology of expulsion, of elimination of the other group. And that's why it was difficult to convince publishers to accept it, because it's not just an historical observation, it's an accusation of Israel of committing a crime against humanity in 1948. Now, from there on, of course, I was already looking at a wider perspective of the history of Palestine. And that's when I encountered, this was not my term, but I encountered those Palestinian historians who worked for many years before me and during the time of my work, and were looking at Zionism as a whole, not just in what happened in 48, but in Zionism as a whole, as a settler colonial movement. And when you accept the paradigm of settler colonial movement, namely the Zionists were European settlers who came to take someone else's homeland. And as like many other settlers, they were refugees, but that doesn't prevent them to make other people refugees. You understand that this is not a one-off event, that until there is a complete displacement of the indigenous people, the displacement, namely the ethnic cleansing, continues. And that's where the term, the Arabic term, al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing catastrophe, and the academic paradigm of settler colonialism as being a structure in history. Namely, it's not one event, it's something that continues all the time, as long as the ideology behind it is the ideology of displacement of the native people and replacing them with settlers. That's when the two kind of narrative term, Nakba Mustamirra, and the academic paradigm, structural displacement, united. And I became a great believer that this is the best way to understand both the essence of Zionism, it's the policies of Zionism before 48, the policies of Israel after 1948. And in fact, I think this is a paradigm that explains to us very well what Israel is doing today in Gaza as well.
Thank you so much. I actually, when I first heard about your journey, I was very, very curious, and especially because, as you mentioned, it was not linear, and it was not easy. It wasn't like, as you said, you've got an idea and you're like, oh, I understand, which takes me to the next question about how history has been recorded, not only what is the historian's journey, because I think you had a unique journey, which means that does not guarantee that everybody will have it and then will have this reflection. So that means let's look at the existing history. And it seems that history has been documented in different ways when it comes to Palestine, Israel. There is the kind of Zionist perception of it, and there is the Palestinian perception. As you yourself have been a person who's stepping away from the Zionist version, as you mentioned just now, it has been so significant that you've been given a new title as the new historian. I think also somewhere else you said you're the last new historian, which I want to ask about it. But would you please elaborate on new historians? Who are they, and are you still the last one? But also, what I really want to hear from you is that a Western version of history. Our group is based in Germany, as I mentioned before, and one factor that motivated us to create this series was related to what seems to be the failure of Western academia to approach the situation in Palestine in a balanced and fair manner. How do you evaluate the Western academia's neutrality on this topic, and with the special focus in Germany, if you may?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a much wider phenomenon here. And this is the phenomenon of how does the West, or one should call it actually the global North, produces knowledge about the global South, or the West about the East. And of course, we have a very good guide to begin this examination with the seminal work by Edward Said, called Orientalism. I beseech anyone who has not read Orientalism to read it. I think it's a very good introduction to the connection between power and knowledge in the production of knowledge about the Middle East in general, or even the Muslim world in general, and on Palestine in particular. And what you learn from Said, that in the global North, there were powerful, and there still are, powerful institutions. They can be economic institutions, they can be political institutions, they can be strategic institutions that are influencing those who produce the knowledge, namely the academics. But it's also true about other people who produce knowledge, such as journalists. You can also produce knowledge in a fictional way, as you know. You can be an artist, you can be a filmmaker, a playwright, and you can also convey a certain narrative. Not only academics have the power to influence people, or not only academics will determine who tells the story of Palestine and who believes to the story that is being told on Palestine. Now, if you go back to Said, you can see that these powerful institutions and powerful factors did not hesitate to claim that their version of events, their narrative, is objective and scientific because it is supported by the people who are supposed to be unbiased historians, namely those who work in the universities. But we learn through again and again that facts and documents are not the only material that influences the version of history that historians write about. not necessarily because historians want to lie or fabricate, but because this is human nature. You think about your academic career, you think about Germany today, think about the atmosphere in Germany. I just visited Germany in November, and I was told that in certain universities, you are not using the word but when you talk about the situation today in Gaza. So these things influence the way you write, the way you research, the work you teach, the way you teach. And what we can do is not only work as historians, but also as sociologists of knowledge, which means we also understand where is the fabrication or the lack of truth coming from. What are the motives? What are the limitations? What are the pressures on historians? And one of the most important and interesting, and I will come back from this, I'll go to the new historians and what they did. One of the most interesting one is the connection between ideology and historical narrative, in particular national ideology and historical writing. Some good observers of the influence of nationalism on professional history writing say that there's a situation where sometimes there is a hidden hand that writes the history for you. And the name of that hidden hand could be Zionism, nationalism, capitalism, whatever you want, or Orientalism. Namely, that hidden hand would make you write in a very derogative way about people in Africa, maybe about women, maybe about children, maybe about workers. I mean, it depends what the material we're talking about. And this kind of tribal writing, where you are either consciously or unconsciously writing for the sake of the nation, is especially important in situations of conflict. Because if there is a conflict, the side you supposedly belong to believes that the narrative of history is another weapon among the other weapons that are being used to win the battle. Whether the battle is over land, control, dispossession, colonization, or anti-colonialism, doesn't matter. And as an individual person, it's very difficult to not to be recruited to that kind of writing. So what we had in Israel, in the first generation and second generation of historians who wrote the history of 1948, they were very loyal to the Zionist ideology. And they, even when they had the ability, and they had the ability before us as new historians, to see the documentation, they interpreted them in a way that would not contradict the Zionist ideology. Even more important, would not contradict the Zionist self-image of being a very moral movement, a very civilized movement, coming to the desert of Palestine, meeting barbarians and savages, and therefore they could read the documents of an expulsion of a village and claim that this was actually self-defense against a barbaric attack. You will hear exactly this tomorrow from the Israeli very esteemed judge Barak. You will hear the same way of interpreting facts according to an ideological narrative. You will hear tomorrow at the ICJ, in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He will tell you that the killing of women and children and the lack of food and so on, he would not deny it. I can assure you, he would not deny that this is happening in Gaza, but he would say that the Palestinians are doing it to themselves and that Israel is not responsible for that. So there is here, and not we are not arguing with with Judge Barak about the facts. We all agree about the facts. I think he will even agree about the number of dead and wounded. Maybe he will change it, but I think he will agree with that. But that is not the only thing. The thing that is, which is at the heart of the court of justice, at the heart of the historical judgment, is why were people killed in such high number? Why are people dying of hunger? Or coming back to 48, why so many Palestinians were expelled? So let me now say something about the new historians. It was not, I don't like the term actually, but it was used, so I accepted it in a way. It was a very small number of Israeli historians like myself who could not really challenge the documents that they have seen in the archives, mainly in the archives, and mainly in the Israeli archives. And therefore, they challenge three basic myths that that the Israeli narrative is based on when it comes to 1948. The first myth, which is much more important for Israeli domestic consumption than for anyone else, that Israel always says that it was a David that was successfully beating a huge Goliath in 48, namely that the balance of power in 48 was between a small, very small Israel and the whole Arab world. So what we did, we just examined, how many troops were involved in the war on both sides, what was the weapons, and we came to the conclusion that it was not a miracle. That was a very logical conclusion to the success of the Israeli army, because they were better equipped and they had more troops. That's quite simple in a way. The second myth is more important, and that's the myth that you can still find this myth on the Israeli foreign ministry website, that the Palestinians left their homes because their leaders and the Arab leaders in neighboring Arab states told them to leave. And we found out that this was a nonsense. This was a fabrication, and that there were clear directives and orders to the Israeli army to expel people, and that's why the Palestinians became refugees, not because they voluntarily left. And the third thing is we learned actually in this, even the Palestinians did not always like when we said it, that actually there was a willingness after the end of the fighting in 48 to, on the Palestinian side, to reach some sort of an agreement with the Israeli side to discuss the return of refugees, the internationalization of Jerusalem, and the creation and the partition of Palestine, but that the Israelis were in no mood for any kind of peace agreement. But I think the second myth is important, why have the Palestinians become refugees? Why have they lost the land and so on? Why do I say, and it's finally that I'm the last new historian? Because the most important member of that group, Benny Morris, have changed his views about it. And I don't think it was enough. For two reasons, I think I provided something that the other Israeli new historians did not provide. I went on to the ethnic cleansing paradigm, as I mentioned before, which I think is far more important than just being objective about the facts. And secondly, I used very extensively Palestinian oral history testimonies in order to fill the gaps in the historical picture, which other colleagues in the New History group do not believe. I mean, they would believe Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, but they have lack of confidence in Palestinian survivors of the Nakba. I had great belief in these testimonies, and I used them very thoroughly to revise again and again to have a better understanding of what happened in 48.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanna go now to the most I don't know if I may say most used term in Germany these days, which is anti-Semitism. So it is actually it's one of the most repeated terms in general, particularly when it comes to justifying Israeli violations of international laws. How has this definition or its usage changed historically? If possible, not only to explain it through the Israeli usage, but Western usage, particularly Germany, because we saw a quote from your lecture in Marburg last November, in which you said Germany is like a big propaganda officer for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yes.
So how do these things work together? Looking at them from the historical perspective, Germany and the West, and also, again, you using another article's views from last year where you said, sorry, from 2022, where you said Germany and Palestine, Germany is on the wrong side of history twice.
Yeah.
So with all that in mind, tell us a little bit more about anti-Semitism.
Yeah, definitely. I think the definition, not only the definition of anti-Semitism has changed over time, but also the way they were used and the purpose of trying to understand who is an anti-Semite, or what is anti-Semitism, and no less important, how to challenge it. I think, first of all, it begins after the Second World War. People refer to the kind of ideologies and both religious and nationalist ideologies that targeted the Jews collectively as a group that is either anti-Christian or is, is kind of intoxicating or toxicating the national identity or collective. So we have a clear a kind of reference, mainly in historical sense to begin with, to certain chapters in mainly European history, a little bit also American history, of the kind of conversion of the way Jews as a collective, people of the Jewish faith, Jewish religion, were collectively framed, first of all, by the Catholic Church, then by the Evangelical Church, that is the Protestants, and then by romantic nationalism that emerged in places like Germany, France, and Italy, and later on also in Russia and Eastern Germany. So I think that's a definition we can all agree with if we look at the way such ideas that blame the Jews either for the assassination of the killing or crucifixion of Jesus Christ, or for all the troubles in society, led to pogroms and attacks and discriminative legislation against Jews. Of course, Europe was trying to build a different world after 1945. And anti-Semitism was not the only form of racism, and people understood it. And that's where you had all these kinds of conventions and covenants, like the Human Rights Declaration in 1948, the Genocide Convention that is now at the one we are examining in The Hague, and other United Nations declaration to make sure that not only anti-Semitism, but any form of racism is regarded as a crime and as something that societies, governments, and societies alike are willing to challenge. Now, where does the plot begin to change? I think it begins to change after a little bit after 1967, because up to the June 67 war, for the wrong reasons, but doesn't matter, in the West, definitely in Germany, but in the West in general, the global North in general, Israel was looked as the little country, defending itself. And when the Israeli lobby wanted to receive support before 67, there was not enough information and not enough willingness to accept the legitimacy of the Palestinian liberation movement. They were still mostly regarded as terrorists. And therefore, up to 1967, Israel did not have to use anti-Semitism very much in order to receive the international legitimacy and support that he wanted. But the longer the occupation of 67 continued, the longer it continued, there were also better ways of understanding what Israel is doing in the occupation, whether it's in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. And I think once you had the Israeli attack on Lebanon in 1982 and the atrocities committed by Israel there, and definitely the way Israel reacted to the first Intifada, which was mostly a non-violent uprising in 1987, then Israel began to lose the moral legitimacy, especially in the civil society, especially among young people who are today not very young. We were young in 87, but there was the young generation of the 1980s. And the young generation of the 1980s, even in Germany, could say, yes, of course, we understand what Germany did, but that doesn't justify what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. So the Israelis were really worried. They were losing the moral battle, if you want. And that's when they start to weaponize anti-Semitism, to include it not as a form of racism against people of the Jewish faith, but as an accusation that equates anyone who criticizes Israel with being an anti-Semite. Now, why does it work in Germany better than in other places? I don't think I need to explain. It's clearly understandable why in Germany it intimidates people more easily than it would intimidate them, let's say, Norway or Denmark. But for a while it worked. For a while it worked with at least politicians and mainstream media, not only in Germany, by the way. It worked also in other places. Whether these politicians and journalists knew that they are falsely accused of anti-Semitism or not, they decided they don't need the headache of being called anti-Semites, and they used to tame their criticism in Israel or censor it a bit. By the year 2000, or by the beginning of this century, Israel feels, and that's because of the second intifada, especially because of what Israel was doing in the second intifada, that it's not working anymore. I mean, especially not with the younger generation of the beginning of the 21st century. Every young generation challenges Israel because it's more distant from the Holocaust. It doesn't deny the Holocaust. It feels responsible, but of course it does not responsible, and it isn't responsible directly. And therefore, and if it's true about Germany, it's definitely true about the West in general. And the occupation is uglier, is more ruthless, is longer. So if you take these two things together, people are saying, no, I'm not an anti-Semite. I know what you're doing in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. You're killing people, you're arresting them without trial, you're demolishing their houses, you continue to expel them, you don't allow them any basic human rights. So I'm against you. I'm against you, not because you are Jewish or not Jewish. I don't care. I'm just against anyone who would use such policies. So accusing these people of anti-Semitism was not working anymore. Or working less effectively. And then Israel decided to do something else. It took over a reasonable definition that the Swedish government offered, which is called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that Sweden created, which meant that there was a worry in Sweden that Swedish pupils began to forget what the Holocaust was all about. And that's okay, that's a noble idea. And it convinced other European countries to make more effort to strengthen the teaching about the Holocaust in, school curricula, universities, and so on. That's fine. Israel took over this project and said, no, this should be done in order to protect Israel from accusation of being colonialist, occupation, genocidal, ethnic cleansing, and so on. So now what they succeeded in persuading the Europeans that if you challenge Zionism, if you criticize fundamentally the state of Israel, you're also a Holocaust denier. You're not just an anti-Semite. You're a Holocaust denier, and that's even a worse kind of accusation. And I can see it works in certain cases. It works better in Germany because the German politicians are cowards, are really cowards. They have nothing to be afraid of anymore. Germany did all it could and did more than it it did all it should, but it did all more than it could to make sure that Germany compensates for the Holocaust, does not forget the Holocaust, and so on. And yet they are unable individually or collectively to be loyal to the kind of moral values that the new German Republic after unification is committed to. They do not follow it when it comes to Palestine. And that's why I'm saying, Germany is responsible for what happened to Palestine no less than the Zionist movement. The whole way anti-Semitism evolved in Europe, the whole way it reached its peak with Nazism, and the whole way that Europe decided to solve the anti-Semitic problem of Nazism by allowing the Jews to colonize Palestine instead of building a better Europe without racism, it means that Germany, if it continues to support unconditionally as it does, not only Israeli policies, but particularly now the genocide in Gaza, it will find it that in history books, this would be recorded as a shameful chapter in German history. And final point, I'm really, really disappointed by my colleagues in the German academia, especially those with tenure, those with an established position. I know that they know they're intelligent, educated people. So I don't suspect here ignorance. It's cowardness. It's moral cowardness, and I feel sorry for them, and I hope that they will understand that for their own, and I say it personally, as for their own sake, to feel good with themselves, if not anything else, that they should be braver and not allow the institution to dictate them how they teach Palestine, how they analyze Palestine, and how they morally view the situation in Palestine.
Again, thank you, and thank you for expressing lots of the ideas that many people are not able to say it out loud, most of them because of their positionality. I'm gonna check with the center if they have in the live screening, if they're ready to ask to give us a few questions from the audience. And I will save my last question for the wrap up, because I really cannot believe we're almost halfway through the lecture. It's going so fast, but we really, really appreciate it. Ali? So also the audience here, we're gonna start taking your questions. Feel free to prepare your questions. We're just gonna first take a few questions from the live screening in the center. Please type down your questions in the question section. Yeah.
They suggest that to pass the question in the Q&A, like on the chat, so you can read them instead of having them one by one.
Okay, so I mean, do you want to turn on the video, or you want to just to type it in for us?
Yeah, we can turn on the video.
Okay, let's just say hi at least. Hi. 1 second. Yeah, Ali, unmute, please. Just let's say hi. Let me also give you a little highlight.
Okay, so Ali.
So these are mostly actually university students.
Hi, good to see you, and I can see you.
Yes. So Ali, so you guys gonna write the questions in the comments, you said?
Yeah, there's
You have
already a
you have
question.
okay.
There's already one I can see.
Okay, so that's great. It's up to you if you want to stay in the camera or you want to switch it off. Are you fine with this, everyone? Okay, good. So the first question, how do you see the role of social media in the Palestinian liberation?
Yes, good to see you all. I think it's a very good question because we have, among the many challenges that we have in the solidarity movement with the Palestinians, is the position of both the political elites in the global north and the mainstream media. Still very difficult to receive a fair hearing, so to speak, in the mainstream media, and therefore alternative media that lives mainly in the social platforms in the internet became a very crucial and useful tool to, first of all, inform people of what goes on, but also help shape ideas collectively and kind of create the guidebook of how to challenge some of the common myths that are being thrown into the air by mainstream media and politicians when they talk about Israel. Of course, social media, as we know, is a very fluid area, and the Israelis are also making a huge effort to be present there and disseminate their ideas. But I think all in all, if I'm thinking about the last 40 years, unlike the mainstream media, the social media succeeded in portraying a far more realistic and accurate picture of what goes on in Palestine, and also was a very important platform to galvanize people, both around solidarity with the Palestinians and, no less important, around ideas such as the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS, and so on. I think that this is a very important one contribution. The second contribution, and I think this sometimes is overlooked, one of the greatest success of Israel and Zionism was to fragment the Palestinians into different geographical or even geopolitical groups. And it's one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons the Palestinians always found it difficult to present a united position, vision, platform, organization even, because of that physical separation imposed on them by the Israeli occupation. What the social media did for the younger generation of Palestinians was to be able to communicate with each other, despite the fragmentation, despite the geographical boundaries, and create a far more consensual discussion and discourse among Palestinians, wherever they are, whether they're in Chile, Detroit, Berlin, in Hilwe or Gaza, to understand how common their fate is and what would they like to do together for the liberation of Palestine. And I think it saved in many ways the PLO, because after 1982, after the PLO leadership was expelled to Tunis, it lost touch with some of the Palestinian communities, especially in historical Palestine itself. And even when it returned as a Palestinian Authority in 1994, the cohesion of Palestinian forces on the ground, as we know, is not very strong. And I think that social media played a very important role in filling the gap and making sure that as a friend of mine said, when people say, oh, Palestinians are disunited, he says, I think most Palestinians are united in knowing what happened to them, what is happening to them, and what they want to happen in the future. And we saw it in the huge demonstrations after the 7th of October in different places in the world.
Thank you so much. So we're expecting lots of questions. We try to take as many as possible of them, and hopefully we could get them all answered. But if not, please bear with us. Taking next question. How far do you think we are from the tipping point for Western governments to change their position in order to support a more just life for Palestinians and to recognize the racism in their policies? Is there even a tipping point?
Yes, well, there is a tipping point, but I don't know how far we are from it. I think actually as an activist, I don't really ask these questions. I don't ask how far I am from the tipping point. I ask, did I do enough to bring us to the tipping points? And I think we are doing a lot, all of us, but of course, we are not in the tipping point, which means we have to double our efforts. But I do think we are closer than ever before. Namely, what we are talking here is about the gap between a clear shift in the public opinion or in the position of civil society, both in the global and the northern, in the northern and the southern, in the global north and the global south. A very significant shift in the position on Palestine, but we have not seen this shift influencing the policies of governments as yet, so that it will become an effective transformative factor on the ground. But I hope that we are getting there. There's a nice kind of way of describing what we are looking for, and then we can examine, I think, more accurately if we are getting to that tipping point. If I take the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction, I would say that boycott and divestment, the B and D, are the actions of civil societies. And so far, these actions, although they are very important, have not changed the reality on the ground, as we know. The S, the sanctions, is something that I believe would have an effective influence in changing things on the ground. Every now and then, we are beginning to see the beginning of the S, of the sanctions. For instance, if the ICJ process that we are witnessing today would eventually mature in a decision. And who knows, that could be the beginning of imposing sanctions, because if you are violating the genocide convention, then you will be punished with sanctions. So this is the things to look for, and I do think they are waiting for us in the horizon. I fully am aware that there are two paces here. One is the pace of destruction with a very quick, and a pace of the tipping point, if you want to call it, which is a bit slower. We need to do all we can to narrow this gap. And I think many of us are doing all they can to do it. And I think it will happen. I just hope it will happen sooner than later. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was from Wael, now from Yarmour. How can coexistence be reached when there is so much trauma, anger, propaganda, and also maybe coming generations that will be formed by the events nowadays, like the surviving children and orphans in Gaza, and maybe the guilt that the future generations, not only in Israel, but also in the world, will feel, since the genocide is the most documented and goes on live on social media, unfolding in front of everyone. What are your thoughts on the polarization that we can already see in society?
Well, we have other historical examples of people doing terrible things to other people and are able to build a different life. Germany and Europe is one example. The United States after the Civil War is another. History teaches us that even if there was a long chapter of cruelty, colonization, dispossession, oppression, there's always a human capacity to build life on a different basis. So I'm not deterred by the level of violence, and I think that we should be aware that what we are talking about is actually not peace. We're talking about decolonization, which is difficult for people to accept, because you say, well, we are in the 21st century, colonialism is from the 19th century, what are you talking about? No, decolonization has not yet happened in historical Palestine. And decolonization is not an easy process. I always tell my Israeli friends, this is not going to be a nice process of changing, transition from one regime to the other. It's a messy issue. Unfortunately, it may have some violent actions, but it all depends on people themselves to make it more smooth and less violent. But we don't have to lie to people when we talk about decolonization, given the historical examples that we have. So it won't be easy to rebuild coexistence, but notice, I think we're talking about rebuilding coexistence, not inventing coexistence, because up to 1948, not only in Palestine, in the Eastern Mediterranean, there was a genuine coexistence between people with different collective identities, whether these collective identities were religious, cultural. People knew how to respect each other, how to live and let live, how to participate in the celebrations of another group, and take condolences when they were facing moments of catastrophe or disaster. There, in Palestine itself, you have a very good example. Until 1948, Muslim, Christians, and Jews lived in the same towns and villages. It's only after Israel was created that different religion groups had different habitations. So I think that there is a legacy in the Palestine and in the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole that would help to build something new. And this would be the basis. Not all the wisdom and good ideas are in European history. Many of them are in Arab and Muslim history, and we will need to go to this reservoir of past examples to build a new one. But yeah, it's not going to be easy. It's not pharmaceutical. It can have some ugly parts of it, but I would never say it's impossible. It's possible. And many Jews probably in Israel would not be totally happy with that and maybe not stay. But altogether, this is the only way. Either it's a mutually assured destruction of two sides, or the two sides learn how to live but on the basis of equality, decolonization, and the end of oppression.
Thank you so much. I don't know how to say this, but we have so many questions waiting and only 30 minutes left. So I don't know if there is
Maybe
a
we'll take 3 questions in one row, and then we'll
yes, I was gonna say number one,
yeah, and
let's
then we
take a
can, and I'll try to be short. Yes, and we'll have
I totally
unfortunately
because
even half an hour. Yes.
sorry,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, but every word you're saying, it makes perfect sense, and like we're getting so educated about it. But I feel that the audience is already telling us that we're skipping some questions. So I'm gonna take 3 questions at the same time. The first one is from Anonymous. The Palestinian destruction is instead due to an articulated state policy. How such policy is made to be globally acceptable. Second question from Jude. My question is, how do we move forward, especially fascism on the rise in Europe and specifically Germany? How can we overcome the previous shortcomings of the left and organizing toward decolonization? Okay, had someone unmuted. Yeah, so how can we overcome the previous shortcomings of the left in organizing towards decolonization and the one-state solution? And how do we, that's still one question, how do we transcend current obstacles, and what do we need to focus in terms of organizing? The last questions I'm taking for this round is from Afreen. Hello, I'm Afreen from Kashmir. It's an honor to directly ask questions to Professor Pappé. Thank you for this opportunity. How have the actions and existence of the occupational state of Israel shaped international morality and conditions of the oppressed across the world?
Okay, great. In fact, these 3 I can answer them in one answer actually, and by that also give space to other questions rather than answer 3, because I think they all relate to something that I'm currently working on, and I think that you will find that it relates to all 3 very important points that were made. I think we are in a situation where you can say that with regard to Palestine, there are 2 alliances that are clashing, and they will influence the reality in the short term and also in the long term. One reality, you can call it global Israel. Global Israel is the alliance that provides immunity for Israel in terms of the United Nations, in terms of bilateral relations to continue strategic help to Israel, financial help, military help, and so on. Global Israel is made of many governments in the global north, multinational corporations, security firms, military industry, and some governments in the global south. I don't think that all the members of those who are automatically giving Israel a carte blanche to everything it does are necessarily believing that Israel is morally right, or they themselves are interested in moral consideration when they consider supporting someone or negating someone. But it's a powerful alliance that makes sure, for instance, that Israel is not being condemned in the Security Council and gets enough trade and help in order to be able to continue its policies. Unfortunately, there are even some countries in the Arab world who are part of that global Israel. Now, the Global Palestine is the other coalition. Global Palestine is made mainly of groups in civil societies, but also some governments in the global south that are seeing Palestine as a struggle, first of all, for justice, but one that is closely associated with their own struggle for justice. And I think that is something new that happened, which is very important, that groups that supposedly are very far away from Palestine geographically, like the African Americans or the Native Americans in Mexico, are seeing their struggles against racism, for equality, for redemption of their rights, as closely associated with the struggle of the Palestinians for their rights. And that creates a global alliance that I call Global Palestine. Now, it's very clear from the situation on the ground that global Israel is more powerful in terms of changing the reality. But this is something that can change and is changing, but not enough, as we talked about it in the first question. And so I think that there are certain things that have to happen in order to make global Palestine more effective. For instance, we are still in need for a far more organized United Palestinian representative body that would embody the ideas of most Palestinians about liberation, decolonization, about the place of the Jews in a future decolonized Palestine. When all these things are happening, then it's even easier to gel the global Palestine into a more powerful position. And we all have to probably do what we're already doing, but just double our efforts legally, politically, morally, vis-a-vis our governments, our parliaments, our mainstream media, and just believe that the fact that we don't see the dividends immediately doesn't mean that it's not going to have an impact. It's going to have an impact, I'm sure about it. So I think this is where we are in all these issues. So the Palestinians have an agency there. We in the Solidarity Movement have an agency to do more. I hope also that my friends in Israel, who are very small, but anti-Zionist Jews, have their agency to do their role. And I think when these forces will work together from in the inside, from the global solidarity movement and from the Palestinian liberation movement, like in the case of South Africa, we will see eventually positive results also on the ground.
Well, I see your, as I think Gideon Levy once described you like extremely optimistic. So I think you still are, which is good.
Yes.
I'll I'll take a bunch of the questions that came from our friends live in Mosaic Center. So sorry for now the big amount. The first question all these questions delivered by Meg. The first question: how do you evaluate the efforts from some media and politicians to set the responsibility of the current situation in individual Israeli politicians and parties, and not in the state itself? It is Netanyahu's fault, etc. Second question: what's your opinion about the opposition in Israel, and what should the public opinion of the global north understand better about it? Thank you. And then another question also from the center: the right of Israel to exist appears as an effective limit to freedom of expression in Germany, and the chancellor even characterized it as the country's reason of state. How do you understand the form in which this issue is framed, and why would the existence of a state be the state's reason for another one? And let's check. There's just one more from the center.
Okay.
As a scholar specializing in the settler colonial paradigm applied to Israel and Zionism, do you think there is academic merit or value or / consideration to be held in looking at Israel as a form of a failed land back movement? This is a position I don't hold, but has come up from Jewish friends or family, and something I struggle to answer.
Can you just repeat the last, as a failed? I didn't understand.
As a failed land back movement.
I don't understand what it means. Probably a translation from Germany or Arabic. Failed land back.
Meg, if you could type up what it refers to, the land back movement. Oh, actually, you guys, you have. Oh, there you go. We have the person asking.
Okay.
There you go. Unmute. Do you wanna clarify?
You have to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, now I hear you. Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Not German, not coming at this from a Zionist perspective. Want to clarify that this is a question that I've just had come up within my Jewish community and from Jewish friends. And the land back movement, they're taking that sort of from the land back movements in Canada as like, yeah, indigenous movements for land back rights in Canada. And there's just, yeah, I guess.
So that they see themselves as the indigenous people of Palestine coming back.
Yeah,
That's what you mean.
Yeah, that's what
Okay,
they
okay,
yep.
now I understand you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. I understand you now. Okay.
Okay,
Good.
thanks.
Okay. Very good. Okay. Excellent. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. I think also these questions are really connected, and it really begins with Israel still being a settler colonial state, which means that Zionism is still a settler colonial ideology now institutionalized through a state, and because of that, you cannot avoid accusations of acting as a settler colonial state through the most important logic of settler colonialism, which is the elimination of the native. You cannot avoid these accusations by saying, oh, there's only few politicians who believes in it, or there are only few Israeli politicians who say it. You can see the whole history of the settler colonial project of displacement and replacement. And you understand that as since most of the Israeli Jews subscribe to Zionism, they subscribe to the moral validity of this project of displacement and replacement. So I think it's not a way of, this is not a good way of avoiding the problem in historical Palestine. And the problem in historical Palestine is the Zionist ideology, not one individual or another. In a similar way, the question of the opposition is important here, because for many years in places such as Germany and the West, people said, oh, well, wait a minute, there is a Zionist left, there is a liberal Zionism, there is an opposition. But there isn't an opposition to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The left, the Zionist left, is the one who perpetrated the ethnic cleansing in 1948. The Zionist left is the one who began the colonization of the West Bank until it fell from power in 1977. It is the Zionist left that ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians during 1967. So there is no hope, and that's I'm saying it very unfortunate, but there's no hope for change within Israel. If someone says the ways the situation will change in historical Palestine is when there will be a change within Israel and a more reasonable, more pragmatic, more peaceful, more moral people would lead the country. This will not happen. This will not going to happen. The Jewish society is not going to change by itself. It might change if pressure from the outside would be more effective, if the Palestinian movement would be more united, and other kind of conditions would mature, but it would be the last thing that would happen. But I'm optimistic, as you said. I think it will happen because I know that, and in a minute I will relate to the right of exist and the other question of back to the land. I remember going to South Africa in 2014 and meeting a lot of white people, and every white person I met said to me, you know, I was against apartheid. And I said, well, if you were all against apartheid, why did it take so long to bring it down? But what I did realize that once there is a decolonization, when there is a fall of apartheid, people are very quick to identify with the new reality rather than stick to the old one. So there is, it's important to understand what is the mentality, the ideological mentality of the Israeli Jews, and act accordingly, and not wishing for something that will not happen. Now, as for the right of, I don't think states have or do not have the right of existence. I don't think it's a fascist idea to say that the state is the objective. The state is a tool that has to serve society. It has to serve the moral values of the society. It's the interest of the collective that is the society that created the state. And unfortunately, we know we don't need we don't have to be anarchists to understand that the state became such a power by itself that in many cases, not just the case of Palestine, in many cases it doesn't serve the interest of the people, and it became a power for the sake of power, and that's a big problem. But basically, these are the discussion that we should have of how states become more reflective of the needs of the people it's supposed to serve. And in the particular case of Palestine, the Jewish state obviously does not serve any of the existential interests. It doesn't even serve the survival, as we have learned recently, of the Palestinians. And that's why it has to change. It's not a matter of saying that the state doesn't have the right to exist. It matters of the regime. The nature of the state has to change in order to stop more than a century of oppression and colonialism. Now, as for the failed, the indigenization, that's another thing that settler colonial movements do. Zionism is not the only one. What happens when the settlers from Europe come to a place that belongs to indigenous people, they not only displace and replace the people, they also claim that they are the indigenous people. So they indigenize themselves and de-indigenize the native people. We've seen it in America. I mean, the Americans appropriated the history of the Native Americans as if it was their own history. The Australians did the same in Australia, and the Zionists did the same in Palestine. This whole idea of redemption or redeeming, which is a ridiculous idea that you can claim a land because you lived there 2,000 years ago, can only work in the case of Zionism. In any other case, people would push it aside as a stupid, silly idea that you have a right to a place because you had been there 2,000 years ago. But as we know, people take it very seriously as a reason to support the Zionist claim for Palestine. So I think that there is no way that you can look at the Jews of Israel as the indigenous people of Palestine, apart from a very small group of people who were there, like 1%, centuries before. We have here two communities, a community of settlers and a community of indigenous native people. And yes, they will have to find a way how to live together. But that won't change the fact that one community is a community of settlers that took over by force the indigenous land, and one is an indigenous community that was forced out of its homeland and is still under the danger of being forced out of its homeland. And this is the situation.
Thank you so much, Professor. So as we are reaching our last 15 minutes, I'm going to try to get as many ideas from the question being asked, and then ask you my wrap-up question and ask you to, give us a little wrap-up. It's going to be hard, and I apologize to everyone, but it's really intense and it's really hard to cover everything, but I'm so happy with what we had so far. So we have some questions. Let me start with this one. It says, what do you make of the arguments made today by South Africa and giving Israel's legacy of flagrant violations of international law, even if the court votes in favor of South Africa, as court outcomes are unenforceable? Will we see any real change? I'm going to combine that with also another stuff. So this is one of the things that it's important to wrap up with what is happening today, but also looking forward. There's a question about Benny Morris, but unfortunately it's too long and I cannot go forward to it. I want to focus on what's on the next phase. A lot of people are asking you questions on, for example, what do you advise students who have to make arguments in such a polarized context when they're arguing in favor of Palestine? I would also, there's a question about accountability of German media and politicians for not reporting or commenting what is happening in Palestine. Again, this is in the sense of looking at the future and accountability, if any. I would apologize for people that won't be able to read more questions. So Sorry?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. So my last question would be, and from our group, is what future do you think awaits the West Bank and Gaza after the recent military incursion by the Israeli government? And I know you will say that you have hope, but how do you formulate your hope? Where do you get it from?
Okay, great.
And
Okay, let's start with the arguments of South Africa. I don't know how many of you watched the live stream from the ICJ. I think it was very professional and detailed examination, first of all, on the reality that Israel creates on the ground in Gaza, and no less important, what would happen if this reality continues. That even if you don't look yet on the intention, and we'll come back to the intention, the reality is of a mass destruction that is genocidal, not only in the number of people directly killed by the Israeli bombing and military actions, but also the people dying for the lack of food, health, and proper living conditions, and that it doesn't stop. And I think it was important to have it detailed in such a way. It's very clear that one of the important questions the court will ask, but is it the result of an intentional policy of genocide, which is far more difficult to prove in a way. There is this Israeli game where they allow certain ministers to say, yes, we are going to genocide the people of Gaza. And then the supposedly more responsible leaders would say, no, 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 we don't accept it. You have to ask yourself, so is this really the exception, those clear declaration, or is really the rule is the denial of the others? But what is important here is to understand the composition of the forces that are now running Israel. The November 2022 elections brought a government with a very strong political forces who, even before the 7th of October, declared their support for the transfer of Palestinians and the genocidal policies against them. So these are people who hold positions like Minister of Finance, Minister of Home Security, National Security, and so on. But more important, I think, than anything else is the dangerous game that an opportunist prime minister like Netanyahu plays, and that's why Israel is now in the midst of a genocidal policy. And that is when he says, we will do to the Palestinians what in the Bible was done to the Amalekites. The Amalekites were genocide to the last. Now, he knows his father was a professor of Bible. He knows exactly the Bible, Netanyahu. And he knows exactly when he says it to the soldiers, what does it mean? And I think this is a far more important opportunistic way of him to make sure that the war is seen as a big revenge to what happened in 7th of October, and revenge is translated into ethnic cleansing. So I think, I'm sorry, to genocidal policy. So I think there will be, I believe there's enough there to definitely to have the temporary injunction by the ICJ to say to Israel, you have to stop, because it seems that both in terms of intention and what you're doing is genocide. I claim that some of you would know, I use the term incremental genocide for the Israeli siege policy from 2007 until 2023. I think was also fitting to the definition of genocide. So I don't think it just started on the 7th of October. Now, as we know, because it's a United Nations body, the ICJ, the eventual ability to force a decision lies with the Security Council, and we know what will happen in the Security Council. America would veto any sanctions against Israel. So no, don't expect this decision to stop, unfortunately, to stop the war, but it's a very important decision, if it will be that decision, because it will add to that narrowing of the gap that I was talking about between the civil society and the governments. And maybe some governments, despite an American veto, which would shame America because no one else would join that veto. Maybe we would say, despite of the veto, we're taking seriously the ICJ ruling, and it will have to begin an impact. You know, China has already started some sort of sanctions against Israel, and that might be followed by other countries. Now, what do I suggest to students in the future and so on? And that's particularly talk about Germany, because it can be connected to the question about the immoral position of German politicians and journalists and so on. So let's be a bit more specific about Germany rather than talk in general what students can do. It is very important to understand fully the environment you're working with, namely, what is the price you will pay as an individual if you're going to challenge the way the government and the mainstream media wants you to talk about, not think about, they don't want to involve your thinking, but the way you talk about Palestine and Israel. And it's very clear that anyone who's listening to us today, anyone who's watching us today, the way the German government and mainstream media wants us to talk about Palestine is something that would be a terrible fabrication of what we feel, of what we want to say. We will be forced to, almost like in a dictatorship, to say things that are newspeak in the language of George Orwell of 1984. That is, we have to be aware that what we are being asked to do is really to say things that are contrary to our moral ideas, our moral convictions, and that is something that should be mentioned. Even if you are talking like this, do remind those who force you to do it, because otherwise you might lose your job, you might not might be thrown out of the university, might even be called for the police for investigation. Make just sure that people understand that you are treating Germany as a dictatorship of knowledge when it comes to Palestine. And I think that's very, very useful, because I think it will affect people. I saw it on an individual basis in the kind of context people had with police or university authorities. When they use this strategy, I think it worked much better than saying, okay, I will say what I believe in, even if I lose my job. I don't think everybody has to lose their jobs in order to make their voices heard. And of course, people who are in less vulnerable position should be more expressive and outright and forthright in what they're saying. And I think that would create a different discussion in Germany. Discussion which should not only be who is right, the Palestinians or the Israelis. Discussion is, why does Germany, that prides itself to being one of the most important democracies in the world, does not allow people to say, not to do anything, but to say what they morally and emotionally and academically feel about Palestine. I think that has not been done enough in Germany. I think we're still engaged in answering accusations, saying, I'm not anti-Semite, I'm anti-Semite, so on. I think it has to, the focus should be on the freedom of speech in Germany in general. That is in a big crisis when it's seen through the perspective of Palestine. Now, about the future, your last question, wrapping it up. I really believe that in the longer term, we see the beginning of the end of the Zionist project. I think there are many indicators that show that this is not working. Not all of them are connected to the Palestinian struggle. I think the internal struggle in the Jewish society proved that there is nothing common between the secular and religious Jews apart from war. And that's a big question. Can a society built only on the promise of more war and violence as the only cement that keeps it together? I don't think so. I don't think in the long run you can create a collective identity on the basis of bloodshed. You can for a while, but not for a long while. This is not something you wish for your grandchildren. Secondly, there's a huge economic crisis on the way in Israel, not just because of the war, but because of other failures in the past. and without economic prosperity, it would be even more difficult to create to keep this cement together. And I think the young Palestinian generation is still going to surprise us with a far more organized and united position that will have a huge impact on the reality as well. And we talked enough about the possibilities of the civil society view, what I call global Palestine, beginning to affect the position from above, the global Israel. So I am worried about the short term, definitely. I don't think that all these processes that I'm talking about are going to mature very quickly. I don't know if it's 10, 20, 30 years, I have no idea, but I'm sure they're going to happen, but they're not going to happen very quickly. And this is why, of course, demonstrating, pressuring, and first of all, getting an end for the fighting, namely a ceasefire immediately, is a very important goal. Also, not allowing people to forget what goes on in the West Bank. More than 200 Palestinians were killed by the Israelis. Thousands of Palestinians were evicted from their homes under the shadow of the war in Gaza, because the idea was that the world doesn't pay attention what goes on there. So I think it's also important to mention that. And I think all in all, this whole idea of Israel, that it could use what the Hamas did on the 7th of October, and some of what the Hamas did, at least I personally think, was morally wrong. Some of what it did, they kind of take it as the main justification for all the crimes that they committed before the 7th of October, all the crimes they're committing after the 7th of October. Anti-colonialist movement, and we should not shun from this discussion, anti-colonialist movements everywhere in the world didn't always do everything right, and everything according to the book, and everything according to international law. But never have these rather exceptional actions have invalidated the moral right of the people to continue the struggle for liberation and decolonization. That is very important, not to be bogged down in trying to question and say, oh, nothing terrible has happened on the 7th of October to the Israelis. I think some of us are doing it. I don't think it's the right strategy. I think the strategy is to say, let's contextualize everything that happened in the past, in the future, in the present. And what you have here as a Palestinian anti-colonialist movement that includes the Hamas, that is fighting for liberation and decolonization, does not always fight it fair, if you want, does not always fight according to the rules, but has a just struggle to end not only colonization, but to prevent the further destruction of Palestine and the Palestinians. And therefore we support it. And we support it because we know the vast majority of the Palestinians, and with this I will end, want to live normal life, which people in Germany have and they don't have. All they want is to live normal life. And they want to do it together with Jews, whether with the Christians, with the Muslims. There is no racism as part of the Palestinian national movement. There's a wish for normal life, the kind of life Jews, Muslims, and Christians enjoyed before 48. And there's no reason they should be denied the right to live normal life, regular life. This is a peaceful nation that deserves to have a peaceful future. And therefore, this is why it struggles, this is why it fights, and this is why it deserves our support.
I think it's hard to get enough, Professor. Really, thank you so much. It has been really amazing. We really, really appreciate it. I mean, I keep saying really, but because I really mean it. Our group was so excited when you accepted to be with us. And today we're like, I know we sent you so many emails, but we were kind of disbelieved. So we're very happy to have you with us today, especially that we feel sometimes isolated here in Germany. So this means a lot to us. I would also like to thank everybody who was watching us, and a special thank you to Mosaic Center and our friends in the center, everyone. Thank you so much for going and being there. And I think last but not least, I think I want to thank my colleagues, the organizers who helped, like the soldiers behind the scenes from the decolonial research group at Humboldt University and the Students' Coalition Berlin and all the universities that actually are under these groups. I wish everybody a great evening. Professor Ilan, thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much to all of you. Hope to
Yes.
see you soon, all of you. Thank
Yes.
you. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.